Meet Rubina Akhtar. She lives in Bangladesh and is a teenager, just like us. For the past 2 years she has worked in a sweatshop for Walmart. Rubina has never been to school but dreams of it once she can afford it. She works 16 hours a day and makes 150 pieces of back pocket flaps an hour and receives 14 cents in return. She sleeps in a small room with no protection from the rain and with 8 other strangers. At work, Rubina has been abused physically and verbally numerous times. If she didn't meet her goal, took more than 2 washroom breaks a day, drank water during work, talked to other workers, or any other cruel restriction, the line chief would beat her. They would slash her and smack her until she was bleeding and unconscious. But Rubina was in a dead end. She didn't have any more options, and there are millions of other stories like her. The Grim Reality of Sweatshops by Elma, Dania, and Nadia. What are sweatshops? A sweatshop is a workplace or factory that violates 2 or more labor laws. Some of these violations include child labor, poor wages, too many working hours, and poor working conditions or abuse. In sweatshops, they make common goods such as shoes, clothing, rugs, and toys. Shoes are made in Asian countries, and they often use child labor. Clothing is the most common type of sweatshop industry. They also use child labor, and they immigrate women to Los Angeles or New York to work 60 to 80 hours a week and still make less than minimum wage. Rugs use child labor again, and nearly 1 million children are employed illegally. 75% of children carpet weavers are girls under 14. Toys are made using child labor. Toy maker makes 30 cents in China compared to $11 an hour in the US. The stakeholders are brand name companies like Nike, Guess, Reebok, Walmart, Gap, Forever 21, Old Navy, and many, many more. The stakeholders are also the factory workers. If these companies were to close down their sweatshops, the average CEO of a company would only make 44 times the amount of a factory worker makes compared to the 212 times that they make now. Well, who works in these sweatshops? 90% of workers are young women. 75% of Pakistan's carpet weavers are girls under 14. Most workers are under 14 because they work for less money and are less likely to complain. Sweatshop awareness organizations estimate 85% of workers are young women aged 15 to 25. Some history behind sweatshops is the first ever sweatshop was a textile sweatshop in Ecuador. The date was unknown, but soon after that the sweatshop population started to increase massively, creating awareness out of the British, and they exposed sweatshop conditions. After that, sweatshops became common in American cities, especially on the East Coast. In 1910, the union involvement agreed to improve conditions of sweatshops, and in 1938, the sweatshops began to disappear slowly. But in 1995, the sweatshop population started to gain awareness in the public eye in the U.S. The conditions of sweatshops are horrible. They have lack of benefits, slavery, dangerous, unhealthy setting, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, low pay, minimum wage, and may handle toxic chemicals, solvents, or glues with their bare hands. This map shows sweatshops amounts around the world in 2006. The red represents the countries with an extreme amount of sweatshops. Some of these countries include China, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Ivory Coast, Angola, and Colombia. The orange represents the high to middle amounts of sweatshops. The yellow represents the low amounts of sweatshops, and the green represents the few to no amounts of sweatshops. Many of the countries in green also ban sweatshops in their own countries. However, this doesn't mean that they don't import goods from sweatshops in other countries. Why are sweatshops an issue, you may ask? Well, workers in a sweatshop have to deal with unbearable conditions. These labor workers get an extremely low pay. Some get less than 50 cents in American currency. They have long and suffering working hours. Some have to work longer than 12 hours per day. Horrible sleeping circumstances. They sleep on the floor with hundreds of strangers. Disgusting sanitary surroundings. Diseases can spread, and many other dangers like explosives. And with the dangerous conditions these innocent workers have to face every day, sweatshops go against the International Charter of Rights and Freedoms and also just basic ethic principles. Although you might not think that sweatshops aren't common and they only occur in remote areas, actually 50% of the world's manufacturers employ sweatshop labor. Well, say if sweatshops were to close down, what would happen? Some pros would be that workers would not have to work in unbearable conditions, and they might be able to get an education. However, there are more cons to this situation than pros, because companies would hire more experienced people, and the workers would lose their jobs and not have a source of income to support themselves or their families anymore. And since they have little education, they can't find another job. Also, products would cost more, and people would buy less. Sadly, there are more cons to this situation than pros. So it is up to us, people of first world countries. It is our duty to help people like Rubina. What we can do is we can create public pressure against sweatshops, like creating protests, helping government organizations and charities. We can also create awareness through sharing links with our friends and avoid buying from places that have used sweatshops to process their goods. And this will all cause sweatshop stakeholders to improve their sweatshop condition.